You know, this is the greatest country, Congressman Gohmert, in the world, as you know. There's a reason why people from all over the world want to come to the United States. Never in the history of the world has a nation been more welcoming to immigrants, to people from all corners of the globe who are seeking a better life, seeking freedom. No nation in the history of the world has given more opportunity to people from all backgrounds, all ethnicities, all nationalities, who come here legally, seeking to join us, to strengthen us as a nation, to make us a stronger nation, a more perfect union. People from all religions, all faiths, all races, all ethnicities, seeking desperately to come to the United States of America. A country that is under assault for who it is as a nation by those on the left, by those on the other side of the aisle, who condemn this country and want to change and transform this country into that from which these people are fleeing. You know, I had a reporter say to me once, well, there's not an easy fix here to the immigration situation. And I said, well, it may not be easy, but it is simple. All we've got to do is go back to the policies that were working a year ago that had largely defeated illegal immigration at our southern border. We know that walls work. I've been to the border, had the privilege of going to the border 3 times, twice to Arizona and once to Texas in my first nearly 10 months here serving in this Congress. Something that apparently our president has never done, and our vice president has certainly never done during her time as the quote-unquote border czar. But as I went and saw firsthand for the first time in my life, I'd driven past the border previously just from a car, and I could see, you know, the meager fence that was there before the previous president. But I'd never actually gotten out and visited and walked and talked with the people who live there. The people who are subjected to this illegal invasion, these folks, some of which are very dangerous, but all of which are coming very desperately for different reasons. Coming on their property, vandalizing, invading, threatening, in some cases harming. I met with a rancher family who had a family member killed by an illegal alien. But meeting with ranchers, law enforcement officials, Border Patrol, those on the front lines living with and then also working best they can under this administration, frankly against this administration, to try to do what they can to deal with the border crisis. And walls do work. The enforcement that we had in place a year ago was working, ending catch and release, establishing MPP, the Remain in Mexico policy, turning folks away through Title 42 policies. We were on the way to fixing our illegal immigration situation. But this administration, with complicit help and support from this majority, of this Democrat majority in this Congress, is not just neglecting our southern border, not just failing to fix our broken illegal immigration situation, but they are part and parcel, complicit and intentional in facilitating this invasion, and as you know all too well, as you've already touched on, hiding it from the American people as they do it. And I yield back to you, Mr. Gohmert.
Well, and as my friends noted, there are so many crises that are going on right now. We have the economy being harmed even more by policies of this administration. With the president and all of those working with him and for him demanding that everyone be vaccinated, and the president himself has said, we need to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated, and he's saying the way to do that is make sure all the unvaccinated are vaccinated. So this administration's solution is we got to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated by making the unvaccinated get the vaccination that does not protect you from the unvaccinated. It makes no sense. And as some doctors have said, You if somebody put out a vaccine that killed 200 people, they would immediately slam the brakes and say, whoa, 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 wait, let's hold up. We got to find out what the problem is here. But we know from reports that have been made that there are people that have died from having the vaccination. We're thrilled that the vaccines were produced so quickly. President Trump got a lot of the red tape out of the way. However, it ought to be a choice after talking between a doctor and a patient, and the doctor understanding the risks inherent because of the biological makeup of this person for taking the vaccination, and then let the individual decide. But if the vaccination works as good as we were told originally it did, then there should be no vaccinated person really concerned about those that are unvaccinated because they would be protected. I'm glad that the administration is starting to have cracks in their adamant position that having had COVID and having antibodies is just not nearly as good as having a vaccination. I'm glad they're starting to, some of them at least, observe the science that, it's probably a little better if you've had COVID, had the antibodies, as far as your future in fighting it off. So I'm encouraged by that. But then I see this article from October 19th. As we know, we talked about before, the president, I believe he's doing something illegal in saying you've got to have the vaccination. And then he comes out and says, we're going to have OSHA put together a rule requiring everybody to have the vaccination. But the president himself does not sign an executive order, which could be taken to court. It's just the general policy of blackmailing companies, private firms, that we're coming after you if you don't force your employees to have the vaccination. It's really a bit insidious the way it didn't even give people a chance to file suit. You just state a policy you're going to follow and then have everybody follow it. Well, it makes it much more difficult to sue. But this article says OSHA will not enforce 29 CFR 1904's recording requirements to require any employers to record worker side effects from COVID-19 vaccination. The Biden administration is forcing you to take the jab in order to work, and simultaneously, the Biden administration does not want the employer to tell them about workers who were injured by the jab. Simply more evidence the vaccine mandate is not about your health. So that's a little disturbing. You would think if anyone cared about science and really cared about people, you would want to know about every abnormality, every adverse consequence of taking the vaccination, because we're really concerned about individual health. But that's not this administration. They're putting out there, we don't want to know things that are bad. And I was informed about a person that had the vaccination and immediately died after the vaccination and was full of blood clots not one, but many. And the physician noted the cause of death was blood clots from a vaccination. And then the family was told the health official will not certify a death certificate if it blames the vaccination for the death. So the widow is in a real bind because you've got to have a death certificate in order to legally move forward and get things changed after the person died. You've got to show proof. And yet, health officer refusing to attribute the cause of death to what it really was, according to the doctor, the vaccination. So that's pretty remarkable that the government does not want to do its job in protecting people. I would think that if someone in government really cared about people instead of caring about being a dictator, they would say, we want to know exactly what happened after a vaccination that went wrong and which vaccine was it, so we can document which ones are safer than other vaccinations. But that's not apparently what's going on in this country right now. So we really need people stepping up and letting this administration know, letting their members of Congress, their senators know that they expect them to speak up. We want complete transparency. What works, what doesn't work. We don't want the government hiding things from us anymore. Yield to my friend.
And once again, just say how privileged we are to be among the some 5% of the world's population that gets to live here, in spite of all the things that we're battling through and we're struggling through as a nation, the crises we're facing, the tyranny of this current regime that's leading us. And our first president, who I believe was our greatest president, I believe divinely inspired, appointed by God to be that first president for the United States, who would not be king, refused to be king. And instead we find ourselves today with one who seemingly would be king if he could, or thinks that he is king, it seems, by actions. In a free country, which we still are to some degree, it is not the government's role to protect us from ourselves. We choose in a free society to endure or be exposed to some risks for our precious freedoms. We're a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, a nation whose founding documents proclaim our God-given right to life, liberty, and the pursuit, not the government provided, but the pursuit of happiness. And here we find ourselves today, something we could almost not have imagined even a year or two ago, where our most precious, most basic of freedoms have been under threat, under assault, or worse, stripping away from us in the name of a pandemic, in the name of an emergency. The American people should make no mistake that COVID policy needs to be viewed through a long-term lens. There is no such thing as a one-time exception. What we will endure or accept or submit to today becomes the pattern, the model for the future. And again, our most basic freedoms we've seen, our freedom of movement, where we can go, our freedom of assembly, who we can be with, our freedom to work and to provide for ourselves and our family, to open our business, to frequent a business, to worship. And then the most basic of freedoms of all, our freedom of our person. That we now have a president, again, who a year ago, because he would not have gotten elected otherwise, said he would not enforce a vaccine mandate, later said he did not have the authority to enforce a vaccine mandate, and you know better than I, constitutionally has no authority to force this vaccine mandate. Setting aside whether or not it's helpful or justified medically, just speaking legally and constitutionally, the federal government has no authority to do this. Certainly the executive does not have the authority to act like a king and do this. And certainly he does not have the authority to compel businesses to do that which he does not have the authority to do. And yet we see a total disregard. This was a president who ran, as the uniter in chief, and instead he's the divider in chief, separating and dividing people based on vaccine status, demanding that people disclose their most basic of personal information, whether or not they have received a vaccine, and then under threat of penalty of their job and worse, not to be able to, again, go where they want to go or do what they want to do if they don't comply with the heavy hand of the federal government. And in this terrible, terrible spending package, which is not just the trillions of dollars, but it's what's in it, one of many, many terrible things in it that the American people need to know about is making the penalty for a business that doesn't comply with this vaccine mandate up to $700,000 per occurrence. And to your point, what a shame, what a travesty that our own government is lying to us about COVID and about the vaccine. Here, we know that medicine and science is supposed to be challenged. It's supposed to be debated. It's supposed to be learned from. We don't want the same medicine from yesteryear. We want the very best from today. That we don't just hold on to what was before. We get a medical diagnosis that's troubling. We get a second opinion. We consult with more than one person. We learn. We establish the evidence. But as you know, this government, this federal government, this executive administration, with their complicit allies in the media and in big tech, shuts down any dissent, to your point, on the stated narrative, the approved narrative, no matter how many times over the doctor-in-chief, the celebrity doctor-in-chief, is proved wrong or contradictory, whether it's like on gain of function or whatever it might be. Any dissent is shut down on the risks of the vaccine. And there are risks. And some people understandably make the decision that for them, because of their health, because of their youth, because of their exposure, or because they have natural immunity because they've already had COVID, or their religious reasons or whatever it might be, they decide they don't want to have the vaccine. And this government and their complicit allies that we've already mentioned are lying to us that there are risks to the vaccine. They obviously have been lying to us about the efficacy of the vaccine because, as you made the great point, we're going to force the unvaccinated to get the vaccine that doesn't protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. They're lying to us about the efficacy of masks. As you know, what we're forced to wear in this chamber when we're not speaking at the lectern, pretending that a cloth mask makes a difference. There's medical documentation for that, which there's very little conclusive evidence to that effect, as you know. Yes, sir.
Read results of one study that indicated that if you wear a mask, you are 0.2 of 1% less likely to get COVID. So there is that. There's at least 0.2 of 1% that it's apparently helpful, but we don't know the results of long-term wearing a mask, the additional CO2 that may be taken in, or germs that are kept in a mask that would have not been breathed in repeatedly. We don't know the results of all of that, but that's fine, but that's still very different from forcing someone to have an injection, which we know can have very adverse effects. And that's why it ought to be an individual decision to make. But these, then again, also contribute to a crisis in enough people doing jobs that allow us to have a supply chain that is intact and getting people the things they need. Little did I know, you may have anticipated, but there were people making jokes after the vice president had said several weeks ago that, it may have been in August, that people needed to get their orders in now so they would get things by Christmas. Wow. Apparently they saw this coming. But to your point, to the point that's been made by my friend about the various opinions from the same people, when it comes to Dr. Fauci, when it comes to the president, it's hard to find an issue that they haven't been on more than one side of. Fauci would say, no, don't use a mask. Yes, you should use a mask. And then he said, use a mask. And then he's seen at a baseball game not wearing a mask, not socially distancing. But then he's given different opinions, and it reminded me of Winston Churchill's comment about Keynes, the economist. Of course, a lot of people say that's Keynesian economics. But if you look back and do some research on the guy, he often, when he got in debate and was confronted that some theory he had wasn't true, didn't work, he would immediately take the other position and say he was not for that, he was for this. And so Winston Churchill had once said, and I believe this is close to verbatim, he said, if you put two economists in a room, you would have three different opinions unless one of them was Sir Keynes, in which case you would have an unlimited number of opinions. And I'm getting that impression from Dr. Fauci, but apparently even Dr. Fauci needs to come to grips with the fact that when he says the U.S. never funded any gain-of-function research, that, okay, the evidence is there, had us going for a while, but the evidence is in, and that is absolutely not true. So hopefully, in all the myriad of opinions he has, he'll come around and find the truthful opinion when it comes to his group contributing to gain-of-function research that help weaponize the COVID virus. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This administration, this executive branch of the government, as you said, is weaponizing its agencies, its departments, its resources against the American people. On the COVID vaccine mandate that you were mentioning, what greater weapon can we use than to strip folks of their ability to earn a living? But it's part and parcel with this government, this administration, this presidential regime, who believes that the greatest threat to America is Americans, conservatives, patriots, those who vote the wrong way as they see it, those who might have supported the previous president, those who show up to school board meetings, those who don't get a vaccine that they say you have to receive. They're weaponizing the IRS. Here in this budget again that they want to approve, the trillions of dollars, they want to hire some 85,000 more IRS agents so they can be more effective in their assault on the American people. Here, we're turning the federal government against parents who show up at school board meetings to express their concern for their children or what's being taught in their schools, which they have to pay for, by the way. They have to fund. And you see that this administration looks with contempt upon the American people, with contempt upon our law enforcement and first responders, with contempt upon our military, has told our military the greatest threat to the country, in addition to climate, is white supremacy in the military, is racism in the military. And we see the CRT forced upon our military while we've got the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying he wants to understand what white rage is. I would like for him to understand what China's doing, what's going on in Afghanistan, what's up with North Korea, what's up with Iran, what's up with Afghanistan. But instead, they're focused on weaponizing the federal government and all of its resources against our very citizens.
My friend has such a great point. To have the Attorney General of the United States jump into issue of disagreements at school board meetings is absolutely astounding. We have record crime, especially in cities controlled totally by Democrats. The crime is going up tremendously. And yet, and I know that Merrick Garland knows the Constitution, at least he has at one time, and he knows that there is no mention in the Constitution of a federal role in education, and yet he sends out a memo saying, basically, it's pretty intimidating, that we're going to start digging into these school board meetings and weaponizing, using the Justice Department to go after people who have differences of agreement, that happen to agree with Dr. King that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. So who would have believed that 40, 50 years after it seemed we were so close to Dr. King's dream being realized, that you would have an administration totally committed to undoing Dr. King's dream and going back to judging people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. It's just shocking. But then, and of course, the saying in Washington is, and has been for many years, no matter how cynical you are, it's never enough to catch up. Well, then we find out after Attorney General Garland sends out the letter that he's going to go after these people that are in disagreement, that lo and behold, it turns out his son-in-law and daughter make a tremendous amount of money selling things in support of critical race theory, judging people by the color of their skin and not by the content of their character. And I noticed, let's see, it's Panorama Education, was co-founded by Zan Tanner. They sell surveys to school districts, according to this article from Callie Pattison. And that has a nationwide focus on, quote, social and emotion climate, which is interesting. I guess they're wanting that climate changed as well. But contracts in more than 50 of the 100 largest school districts in the U.S., Panorama Education claims to be supporting, quote, 13 million students in 23,000 schools and 1,500 districts across 50 states. Panorama Education co-founder Zan Tanner is Attorney General Merrick Garland's son-in-law. And then it goes on to talk about the 21 different states where they're spreading this stuff. The surveys reportedly give justification for new curricula in schools, which parents have recently taken issue with, such as critical race theory. But since 2017, the company has raised $76 million from investors, and just last month, Panorama Education struck a $60 million private financing raise with General Atlantic. So rather amazing, just when you think you can't get more cynical about what this administration's doing, we find out, gee, there is pecuniary gain afoot here on this issue of the Attorney General weighing into school board meetings. Of course, that's kind of flying in the face of the idea that white supremacy and climate change are the two biggest dangers to America. It's just, for those of us that had incredibly good constitutional law professors, we know those professors would say, where is the federal nexus? There has to be some federal reason, something that gives the federal government the right to come in and control school board meetings. Of course, shortly after I got here, I had a law that I was working on. Because having family involved in schools, my mother was a school teacher, and I know back then the administrators had the teachers' backs. But now, because of so many lawsuits so quickly filed, administrators would say things to teachers like, look, I realize this student is a total disruption to your class, but his mother or father or both will file lawsuits, and we don't need a lawsuit, so just do the best you can. And that would disrupt the education of other students. So my thought was, well, as a judge, I had what was called judicial immunity. You may not like my rulings, but you can't just sue because you don't like the rulings. There was judicial immunity. And I thought, what if we created an educational immunity? You may not like what a school does or a teacher does, or principal, but unless they have committed a crime, you can't sue them. And that would allow things to get to the place where they used to be when I was growing up. If you had a problem with a teacher or some issue in the school, then you went to the school board meetings, like the Attorney General's trying to stop now. And if somebody on the school board or too many on the school board didn't see it as a problem, then you ran for the school board, got elected, and fixed it. But because of lawsuits, that's totally changed the way schools have had to approach things. So what if we gave them educational immunity? And I'd ask for representatives from the National Education folks, and they came, and I made the presentation, and I was totally shocked when they said, we're not sure that we could support that. I'm going, but it would keep your teachers from being sued at the drop of the hat. People could go to complain to the school board, but you couldn't just go after a teacher. Well, it turns out they eventually got back to me and said, yeah, they wouldn't be able to support that bill. And I was just mortified, mystified too. Why would they not be behind that? And then one of my friends that spent his life in education said, Louis, do you not understand the biggest cash cow, the biggest money maker for the teachers' unions is liability insurance. If you take away their liability, then the teachers' unions can't sell and make money off of liability insurance. There goes that big cash cow. Yes, it would make life easier for teachers, but the unions, the people that are making money from unionizing teachers, they will not ever support something like that. So, just again, going back to the old adage, no matter how cynical you get around here, it's not enough to catch up. Constantly being re-educated on that issue. Yield, my friend.
Well, I thank you, Congressman Gohmert, for allowing me to participate with you. And just the final thing that I'll add, we certainly have agreement and recognition, as I think most Americans do, that we have surrendered control from K to 12 through college of our education system to the hard radical left. And it's refreshing to see parents engaged, parents standing up and saying this is not what they're paying for, this is not what they're going to stand for. That's the silver lining in the pandemic as more parents became aware of it. And I'll make one more reference in my final words here to the spending package that's being debated by the majority if they're trying to come to agreement to bring to the floor for a vote. It would take it a step further, as you know, and it would take it to free, not only free community college, which is a step towards free college, and probably eliminating faith-based institutions that wouldn't be eligible for the free college, by the way. The marketplace would probably eliminate them as families chose the free public education. But take the preschool and the child care that's now proposed to be free. Faith-based institutions would not be eligible for the free child care, daycare, preschool. That is an assault on that choice that families make. And then the requirement in this bill would be that daycare workers, preschool workers, would have to have a college education. And that's an assault on those home-based daycare, preschool facilities, because this administration and their allies in academia are determined to get control of our children now from age 2 or 3 in preschool and beyond at your provided taxpayer expense. I thank you for allowing me to be with you, and I yield back the remainder of the discussion to you, Congressman Gohmert.
Thank you. I appreciate my friend from Virginia more than he could ever know, and I'm glad he's here. But along the lines of rights that we've had, that the Constitution has assured, we're finding civil liberties still are being trampled. Article here by Glenn Greenwald. It's just excellent summary on, well, the title tells it all. Civil liberties are being trampled by exploiting insurrection fears. And we have people in this body that are constantly referring to the insurrection on January 6th. We've heard the president and others say that it was the worst attack on democracy ever. And even a person that I don't often agree with, but FBI Director Christopher Wray, even he pointed out that, gee, it's kind of tough for those of us who recall 9/11 to say January 6th was a worse attack on democracy. If you were just judging by time, heard from Attorney General Garland, and it's been in the news, many, I think 200 to 300, were charged with obstructing an official session of Congress for 4 to 6 hours. But if you go back to June 22nd of 2016, we had 26 hours of obstruction of official session of Congress. Congress twice tried to go back into session, was prevented each time, and it was about 26 hours before the efforts of so many to obstruct Congress finally were withdrawn so we could have Congress again. But I didn't realize back then that this offense was out there. I knew there were many violations of House rules that went on. But then when you see, oh my gosh, just obstructing Congress carries up to 20 years in prison, I'd be interested to know if any of those people who were obstructing an official session of Congress realized that they were committing a federal felony carrying up to 20 years in prison and up to $250,000 fine. But fortunately for them, Paul Ryan was Speaker and chose not to really do anything. But those are the kind of things that when the American public see that people are doing things wrong, who are supposed to be making the laws and following the laws, and yet they're the worst violators, it is not helpful nor healthy for the country. I know one of my constituents, and I'm not defending any crimes that have been committed, but is a guy, he was on Ellen after rescuing dogs in a hurricane. He was arrested for his role in the Capitol. And what I've learned from him, his family, these people are being so mistreated. We've heard from other people, but we had a federal judge here that said enough is enough, and he finally held the warden in contempt. And as I understand, the warden has lost the job of being warden. But there's an article from Sarah Lynch, jail violated civil rights of Capitol riot defendant. But these folks are not being allowed to, at least some of them, not to shave, not to get a haircut. And I thought we were decades past those days because I know all the county jails with which I'm familiar, they would make sure people were dressed out, had a haircut, shaved if they wanted to before they came to court, that they were not going to have them forced into an appearance like the Unabomber, looking like some wild, crazy person, making it easier for a jury to convict them because they look like a Neanderthal. And yet that's exactly what the D.C. jail has been doing. And it was reported that after the judge held the warden in contempt, that there was a late night effort by people at the D.C. jail that, as I understand it, is partially under control of Bureau of Prisons, but they sent people to start scrubbing the black mold that was causing problems for some of the prisoners and painted areas that were disgusting, and that they let some of these folks that were arrested because of January 6 events, let them know we hold you accountable and you're going to pay for it. And then some noted a terrible smell of cleaning fluid on their food that they couldn't eat. Many are tired of eating bologna sandwiches for months and months in a row. I do know this. The reports we've been getting indicate that the folks here that are being held in pretrial confinement and are being punished, although that's unconstitutional to punish somebody while they're awaiting trial and not being convicted, that they're not treated nearly as well as bloodthirsty murderers that are being held in Guantanamo. I've been down there more than once. I've seen how things go there, and it is rather tragic that American citizens are being treated so much worse than individuals that want to destroy America, that have participated in the killing of thousands of Americans. But here's one from Gateway Pundit. Newly released videos show January 6 political prisoner Jeremy Brown saving a female Trump supporter who was trampled by Capitol Police. That's from October 20th. Here's an article that was this summer, 6 months since the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Points out that works out an average of 3 defendants arrested every single day, including weekends, since January 6. 235 defendants have been charged with corruptly obstructing, influencing, or impeding an official proceeding and attempting to do so. But this article from Sarah Lynch, October 13th, jail violated civil rights of Capitol riot defendant, U.S. judge says, and I have a copy of that order. But A.G. Garland tried to blame D.C. For conditions at the jail and treatment at the jail, when actually he's in charge of what happens to pretrial prisoners that the Department of Justice is going after. So nice try, but we need people here facing up to their responsibility. And I will just conclude with a comment that I never, ever thought I would hear myself say. But after seeing the partisanship, the use of official position to help daughter and son-in-law finances, thank God Mitch McConnell didn't bring him to be confirmed to the Supreme Court. With that, I yield back.
Do I need to say this? Okay. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This July 4th, we celebrated our 245th anniversary as a nation, and we indeed have a lot to celebrate. Margaret Thatcher once observed that while Europe was created by history, America was created by philosophy. To Thatcher's point, the United States is unique in history in that we are founded on the principle that we are all created equal, and that our inalienable rights are not a grant from government, but they're endowed to us by God, and that a just form of government derives its power from the consent of the governed. These founding principles have made us a city on a hill, an example of freedom and liberty to the world. We truly hold this special place in history. Like every nation in history, we have had our challenges and we've made our mistakes, but we have introduced into humanity the model of a nation not defined by our government, but by we the people. With each generation, we have perfected our understanding of what it means to realize that truth, that all of us are created of equal, and that we're always working toward that more perfect union. A young nation in the scope of history, we stepped onto the world stage with unmatched confidence, knowing that our cause was just. We pushed back against the designs of those intent on world domination, Marxism and its authoritarian expressions of communism and socialism. Emerging victorious after World War II, when most nations throughout history would have required tribute, we instead offered the world the opportunity for partnership in peace. A world where trade among nations, even those nations that would oppose us, would be protected by U.S. strength. In this conflict and others since, we have sought friendship, not lordship, with former foes, working often at our expense to build other nations. Free of political shackles, our scientists have brought the world innovation that has improved people's lives. From the availability of electricity and energy, automobiles and airplanes, our advancements in medicine have saved lives the world over and improved the quality of life for millions. We have reached for the stars, sharing our newfound mysteries of our universe with our planet's co-inhabitants. And with America's rise, humanity has benefited. Here, for example, we see the life expectancy during what we have come to know as the American century has almost doubled, actually over doubled. While there's still work to be done, we can see that global abject poverty has declined dramatically during this time. And while there's legitimate debate about our involvement in global conflicts in the broader scope of history and humanity, we have overseen a period of relative peace. As you can see, our growth in military strength has corresponded with historic lows in conflict fatalities during what historians have called the Pax Americana. Indeed, for so many of us who are the recipients of these blessings, it could seem like these hard-earned relative peace and prosperity we enjoy as Americans and have shared with the world are guaranteed to us and that they'll automatically endure for generations to come. To assume this would be a grave, arrogant, and costly miscalculation. Ronald Reagan once said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or else, one day, we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like to live in the United States where men were free. We would be wise to reflect on history and take stock of this moment and see if there is, and indeed, anything we can learn from history. It is notable that the average lifespan of superpowers throughout history is just around 240 to 250 years. And as I mentioned at the outset, this July 4th, the United States celebrated our 245th anniversary. History would also tell us that there are fundamental reasons for the rise and fall of great nations. Historian and philosopher Will Durant wrote in his 11-volume work titled The Story of Civilization that a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. According to British historian and international relations scholar Paul Kennedy, former great powers typically exhibit the same factors: an overextension of the military and foreign liabilities, economic decline of important manufacturing and agricultural sectors, and fiscal irresponsibility. Does this sound familiar to us in this chamber? But history also reveals to us that there's a cycle to the rise and fall of great nations, a pattern, if you will, that typically the global power structure goes from a multipolar to a bipolar to a unipolar nation. Most recently, we saw this coming out of World War II. Going into World War II, the world consisted of multiple great powers: Britain, Germany, Japan, Russia, struggling for preeminence. After the war, we moved to a bipolar world with the United States and the Soviet Union being the dominant forces. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, resulting in the United States as the unipolar power, fully ushering in what we now know as the Pax Americana. Now, a multipolar world is not a great place to be. Historically, multipolar worlds have been much less stable. Commerce, freedom, travel, and navigation for people are hampered. Human flourishing is stifled as resources are devoted to global struggles instead of innovations and improvements in the quality of life, like hospitals, schools, and research. In spite of this, it should not surprise us that there are powers across our globe that take issue with America's strong influence. that there are nations that would like to restructure the balance of power to diminish American influence and push us into a multipolar world. Indeed, this has been something that Iran has talked about for decades, and they've been vocal in their desires and efforts to diminish U.S. influence and usher in a multipolar world. In Moscow on April 23, 1997, China and Russia signed a joint declaration on a multipolar world and the establishment of a new world order, which states this: the parties shall strive to promote the multipolarization of the world and the establishment of a new international world order. These nations have something in common. They have sought to consolidate and maintain their power, not through the guaranteeing of freedom for their people, but rather through authoritarian rule over them. As Americans, and certainly as policymakers, we would be gravely mistaken to recognize as morally equivalent governing systems that seek to promote, protect, and preserve human liberty with these authoritarian systems that survive through the contraction of these human liberties. And while I may not agree with another nation's efforts to move us toward a multipolar world, I certainly can understand them. I can understand their aspirations to diminish the United States' influence and supplant it with their own. I can understand that they would strive to take the United States' wealth and power for themselves. But what would be shocking to most Americans, though, is that to find that in addition to adversarial nations, there are forces within our government that have been advocating for and working toward this polar objective for decades. They've worked to distort the American system to gather wealth and power from the sweat, blood, and tears of hardworking, tax-paying Americans. Generations of freedom-loving Americans, both in and out of uniform, have given their best under the assumption that this government had their best interest in mind. In 2008, the United States National Intelligence Council released this report, The Global Trends 2025, A Transformed World. In this report, the United States National Council declares the unprecedented shift in relative wealth and economic power, roughly from west to east, is now underway and will continue. The United States' relative strength, even in the military realm, will decline and U.S. leverage will become more constrained. They went on to explain the major causes for this. They said that in terms of size, speed, directional flow, the transfer of global wealth and economic power is now underway, roughly from west to east. It's without precedent in modern history. This shift derives from two sources. First, increases in oil and commodity prices have generated windfall profits for Gulf states and Russia. Second, lower costs combined with government policies have shifted the locus of manufacturing and some service industries to Asia. So they said there's two major trends causing this massive shift in wealth from the American people to authoritarian regimes overseas. Shortly, to summarize, ceding our oil and gas industry overseas and shifting to domestic manufacturing overseas. Now, if the report were simply an honest look at trends, perhaps even a warning to us, I could appreciate that evaluation. But instead of making the necessary adjustments to counter this trend, our bureaucrats in D.C. embraced it and sought to help aid in this fleecing of American wealth in transition toward a multipolar world. As a matter of fact, the report called this transition one of the world's relative certainties. The report, however, based these conclusions on assumptions that we now know are false or at best incomplete. As a matter of fact, the Trump administration showed us just how quickly these assumptions could be upended. The United States, in a matter of months, went from an energy-dependent to an energy-dominant nation, and policy changes were put in place that began to encourage rather than discourage companies to return to the U.S. soil, including manufacturing. Yet those in entrenched places of power in our government continue to endorse this transition as inevitable and look down on those who don't embrace this worldview of the sunset of America's greatness as being inevitable. As a matter of fact, on July 22, 2009, in a speech given in the Ukraine, then Vice President Joe Biden said of the Obama-Biden administration, "We are trying to build a multipolar world." We're trying to build a multipolar world. The Biden administration continues that effort in earnest today, and they're doing it in a couple different ways. They are earnestly at work to both prop up competing powers and us all also working to diminish American strength. And suddenly, as we consider more recent history, what has seemed like a series of policy missteps and blunders begins to make sense. We can now understand the stifling of energy production here at home while encouraging that same energy production overseas, with far less environmental standards abroad. The tax and economic policies that drive American businesses and jobs overseas. The sending of billions of dollars in foreign aid to prop up corrupt powers overseas. We can think about Afghanistan and the withdrawal debacle and the leaving of billions of dollars of our best technology overseas. And the policies that discourage the American worker and stifle economic growth seem less like a tragic miscalculation and more like a plan. All these factors contribute toward this march toward multipolarism, that unprecedented transfer of economic power, wealth, and influence from the American people to competing adversarial regimes. Shall we call that a fleecing of the American people? In this time of turmoil in our nation, the lurching from crisis to crisis, the American people have become disillusioned with, quote, leadership from Washington, D.C. They have watched the fruit of their best efforts squandered away. They have watched their sons and daughters sent to fight endless wars with obscure objectives. Trillions have been spent by politicians with very few actual problems solved. The globalists in our government have been selling away our nation's treasure, the treasure that our parents, our grandparents, and their grandparents worked hard and fought for. And this has become the real divide in our federal government. The contrast between a multipolar globalist worldview that wishes to shame us out of our nation's strength and send America into her sunset years, or a world that believes that what is precious and right in America is worth preserving, and that we should aspire to be that moral beacon of liberty for the world to see, a city on a hill. Here's the good news. Never has a nation been so blessed with abundant natural resources, access to Earth's great oceans, a river system that waters our fertile grounds and facilitates commerce both within our nation and to the world. We have a people who, unshackled by the burden of an overreaching government, stand ready to do their best work, to apply themselves to the next generation of innovation and invention, of scholarship and learning, ready to develop the next generation of cures, to provide affordable food, fuel for our neighbors here at home and abroad, and yes, also stand ready to respond when those intent on tyranny, destruction, and world domination rear their ugly heads. The answer for our nation, and indeed for the world, is not the dismantling of the American system. It's not the embrace of socialist, progressive policies that have failed time and time again, leaving in its wake the shattered dreams and lives of millions. It's not an America ducking its head in shame and retreating from its place of leadership. Rather, it is to embrace what has made America great in the first place. It's in a renewal of the American promise. It's in a return to our shared foundational values, albeit practiced more perfectly. It's in an embrace in our hearts and minds as Americans that we, the people, are what defines us as a nation, that we are one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. This is the great work that lies before us as Americans, for those of us who serve in this chamber and for those of whom we represent. May our efforts be noble and just, and may God shed his grace on us. Thank you.
Pursuant to Section 11B of House Resolution 188, the House stands adjourned until noon on Monday next for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business.